Well, hello again, everybody out there in startup world, and welcome to this week in startups, where I'm just going to go through some of the latest news of startups that's happened this week, mainly talking about takeovers, starting to look at some events that are coming up and that sort of thing. So it's been a pretty good week in startups. Last week was a bit bigger. And so I'll just run through a few things that I've been able to find, etc. So my first little startup story of the week is it actually referring back to the Big Time podcast, which of course you can find on iTunes. This young guy, he's got a company, it's called Boomeranggo, and in 2006 he came out to Australia as a student from Sri Lanka, and he's looked into a couple of things, but at the time, as a student, you can only work so much in Australia. He went on and created spreadsheets and all sorts of things just so that he could keep track of his dollars, which were, limited at the time being a student. And that was sort of the beginnings of what is now Boomeranggo. But then, more recently, it fell by the wayside. At the beginning of this year, he actually got in line with some friends who said, it's quite a good idea. And so he developed the app, which is now Boomeranggo, which is, it's a finance app where you can track your dollars, track what you're spending, and he's starting to get a bit of traction. He's getting downloads on iTunes. And so Boomeranggo, as a startup, it's a good story. And it's a good story because it's a guy that's been able to come to Australia and ply his trade, even though he's an engineering student, and he's been able to get a business up and going. So it is actually a good startup story, and that's my startup story of the week. You can hear more of that over on the Big Time podcast on iTunes. As this is a podcast as well, we'd really love it if you can leave us a rating and review, and so much so, if you leave a rating and review, send me an email, and we'll send you out a couple of goodies as well. So looking at startups this week, the first one that I am looking at is called Zoya Bang, if my pronunciation is correct. Now, it's an after-school services, so it helps school kids with studies. Now, an undisclosed amount has been invested, and it's a Baidu company. So that's from that huge company over in China. They've invested an absolute stack in it, even though they've started it with some young guys. They got in to start that up. So that's a big one over there. Hand Up is a startup focused, and this is here in Australia, and it's really getting traction. Startup focused on homeless people, where you can buy a donation or a donation gift card, and the proceeds of that go to homeless people. So it's called Hand Up, getting some great traction here. They've had some funding as well. I just don't know how much. Runtastic. Look, this is a pretty big story out of Austrian startup company, where it's an app that you can track your run, track how far you run, and I think they even have different runs that you can program in there. They're not the first people to do this, but they have just been bought not too long ago, I think it was February this year, but they've been bought by Adidas for $239 million. Great story. I'm sure the co-founder, Florian Gwoschner, is a pretty happy kid. So, as another one here, called Campaign, which is a furniture startup, and it's actually an ex-Apple worker, an ex-Apple software engineer, where you can FedEx your furniture. And he's taking on some furniture companies, but basically you can purchase a chair online for $400 or so at its top line, but otherwise they're about 110 or something like that. And it gets sent to you on FedEx, and you make it at home, and it can be made in about 3 minutes. So that's a pretty big one, and he's been getting some good startup money there. Startups, here is a prediction. They reckon that the Internet of Things could be a $7 trillion industry, and that's, i.e. the Internet of Things is looking for solutions to connect everything, to connect your software to perhaps your home software. So getting everything connected, they reckon, could be a $7 trillion industry. So startups, get in there. There could be the next big opportunity. Also, here's something big. $1.4 billion has been put into space startups over the last couple of years. So there's something as well if you're looking to go that way. Anyway, Oscar. Google has just invested $32 million into this healthcare startup where they've now had over $145 million in investment capital go in, valuing them at over $1.75 billion. It's a healthcare insurance startup, young guys as well, so well done to them. Varmo, which is a trip planning service, they've just been bought by Airbnb for $1.6 million. BlaBlaCar is a ride-sharing app, and they've just received $160 million. So there's been a bit going to ride-sharing a bit over the last years, as we've seen. Lime is a UK company. They've just raised 1.4 million pounds, which is they're looking at completely transforming the UK energy market. So that'll be one to watch. Nourish, which is a Melbourne meal delivery service. They've just received $250,000 from the Vinmofo founders. Hello Tech has just received $12.5 million in funding, and they're a home tech app where they're looking at expanding that home tech. MapSense is a mapping company or a mapping app or mapping visualization startup. They've just been bought by Apple or received funding by Apple of $25 million. Michelle Phan, who's a YouTube superstar, and she's now she started a makeup delivery service where they're going to take on a couple of the big players that are already there. She's just received $100 million to get that going and get that happening. So that's pretty huge. That's my startup news for the week. There's some big events coming up. If you go online, there's actually the Startup Summit, which is a big one online in Sydney. There's Sydney Startup SidStart coming up in the coming months, and there's quite a few competitions going on. And of course, Innovation 15, the biggest schools program and entrepreneurs program. Get in there, come and win some money to get your startup up and going. Outside of that, thank you for listening in. As I said, we'd love you to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, and we'll speak to you all soon.